I have often reflected that my friendship with Hercule Poirot has exposed me to more peculiar situations than any reasonable man should encounter in a single lifetime. Yet on that fog-shrouded November evening, as I sat comfortably in his immaculate flat in Whitehaven Mansions, I believed myself to be enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. The fire crackled pleasantly in the grate, and I was absorbed in the evening edition of the Times, while Poirot engaged in one of his characteristic rituals, the precise arrangement of his dinner service. Each piece of silverware was positioned with mathematical exactitude, each fold of his napkin adjusted to achieve perfect symmetry. "It is a matter of fundamental importance, Hastings," he observed, making a minute adjustment to his water glass. "When the external world presents itself in chaos, one must create order in the small things. The mind, she requires this harmony to function at her peak efficiency. I hardly think the position of your fork affects your powers of deduction, Poirot," I replied, turning a page. "Besides, there are genuine mysteries occurring all around London. Listen to this: prominent financier found dead in locked study. Or here, society hostess dies under mysterious circumstances in Surrey." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Ah, but you see, mon ami, these newspaper accounts, they give us only the surface, like looking at a pond and seeing only the reflection. The true mystery lies beneath, in the depths where the human heart conceals its secrets." As if summoned by his words, the doorbell's sharp chime echoed through the flat. Poirot's manservant, George, had appeared in the doorway with his customary discretion. "A gentleman to see you, sir, a Mr. Julian Vance. He appears to be in considerable distress." "Show him in, George," Poirot said, dabbing his mustache with characteristic precision. "Perhaps Mr. Vance brings us something more substantial than newspaper speculation." Julian Vance was clearly a man accustomed to moving in the highest circles of London society. His clothing was impeccably tailored, his bearing normally confident, but today something had shattered his composure entirely. His face was pale, his hands trembled slightly, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes that spoke of recent shock. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, his voice barely steady, "I come to you because the police are utterly baffled, and frankly so am I. It concerns a most extraordinary occurrence at the 11th Witness." Poirot leaned forward, his attention now completely focused. "This 11th Witness, it is a person, perhaps, or an establishment?" "A club, sir. A very exclusive club in St. James's. We were, a society of 11 gentlemen, all connected with the law in some capacity. Barristers, judges, solicitors of the highest standing. Once each month, we gather to examine unsolved cases, to apply our collective wisdom to mysteries that have confounded the authorities." "How fascinating," I interjected. "A sort of intellectual exercise?" Vance nodded grimly. "Precisely. We call ourselves the 11th Witness, those who observe after the fact, who see patterns that others have missed. Our meetings are conducted in absolute privacy, in a locked chamber where no servants are permitted. Last night was our November gathering." Poirot's eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity I knew so well. "And I perceive, Monsieur Vance, that your gathering of 11 has been reduced?" "Lord Harrington," Vance whispered. "He was presenting a case, a curious matter involving a death in Surrey some months ago. A man named Adrian Vane, found dead in suspicious circumstances at a country house called High Gables. Harrington had been approached by the hostess of that fatal weekend, a Mrs. Lucinda Harbury, who believed Vane had been murdered." "And Lord Harrington himself?" Poirot inquired gently. Vance's composure cracked entirely. "Dead, Monsieur Poirot. Poisoned before our very eyes, in a room locked from the inside, with 10 witnesses watching. It is impossible, yet it happened." The room fell silent except for the gentle hiss of the fire. Poirot rose and began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me everything, Monsieur Vance. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it may appear. Vance drew a shuddering breath. We had assembled as usual at 8 o'clock. The chamber has but one entrance, which we bolt from within as soon as all members are present. The evening's refreshments, port, brandy, cigars, are delivered beforehand via a mechanical dumbwaiter, which is then locked and sealed. No one can enter or leave until we formally conclude our session. And the members present last evening? All 11 of us. Lord Harrington himself, Sir Felix Braithwaite, Mr. Edward Morecombe, Sir Alistair Monckton, Mr. Lionel Kerr, Lord Yardley, Dr. Pemberton, Colonel Ashford, Mr. Geoffrey Trent, myself, and Mr. Oliver Grant, who, curiously, was also connected to the original High Gables case. Poirot paused in his pacing. Indeed, in what capacity? He was a business associate of the deceased Adrian Vane. Harrington had invited him specifically because of his intimate knowledge of the financial irregularities surrounding Vane's death. Continue with the events of last evening. Harrington had just finished presenting the basic facts of the Vane case. He spoke of suspicious circumstances, of £20,000 that had vanished, of dying words that suggested murder rather than accident. He was reaching for his glass of port to propose a toast when... Vance shuddered. His face contorted in agony. He clutched his throat, gasped something about the 11th Witness, and collapsed forward onto the table. He was dead within moments. The port? I asked. Shared by all of us from the same decanter, yet only Harrington died. The police surgeon suspects cyanide, but how could it have been administered? We were all watching each other, and no one left their seat. Poirot had stopped pacing and was standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of profound satisfaction. Mes amis, we have here a problem of exquisite complexity. A locked room, a shared poison that affects only one victim, and 10 witnesses to an impossible crime. But there is more, is there not, Monsieur Vance? Something you have not yet told us. Vance started. How could you possibly know? Because, Poirot said quietly, you mentioned that Mrs. Harbury had approached Lord Harrington about the original case. Yet you speak of her in the past tense, and you appear more frightened than grief-stricken. I deduce that Mrs. Harbury herself has recently met with misfortune. Vance nodded miserably. She was found dead yesterday morning at High Gables, the same house where Adrian Vane died 6 months ago. The police are calling it natural causes, but... He looked up at Poirot with desperate hope. 2 deaths connected to the same case, and now a third during our investigation of it. Surely this cannot be coincidence. Poirot moved to the window and gazed out at the fog-shrouded street. When he turned back to us, his expression was grave but determined. Indeed, Monsieur Vance, 3 deaths form a pattern that even the most skeptical mind cannot dismiss as mere chance. Hastings, and my coat and hat. We are going to St. James's and then to Surrey. It appears that the 11th Witness is in urgent need of a 12th. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and looked back at our visitor with those penetrating green eyes. Tell me, Monsieur Vance, among your 10 surviving colleagues, how many had prior knowledge of the High Gables case before last evening's presentation? Vance considered carefully. Well, Oliver Grant, certainly, as I mentioned. Sir Felix had some professional involvement, I believe. And... He paused, frowning. Come to think of it, several others made references suggesting familiarity with the details. But surely you don't suspect. I suspect nothing yet, Poirot interrupted gently. But I observe that your 11th Witness Club has become the scene of a 4th death connected to High Gables. That the question that now presents itself is this. Was Lord Harrington killed to prevent him from solving the Vane mystery, or because he had already solved it? With that enigmatic observation, Hercule Poirot stepped into the fog-shrouded London evening, and I followed, knowing that we were about to embark upon one of the most intricate and dangerous cases of our long association. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets was accomplished in contemplative silence. Poirot sat rigid in the corner of our cab, his green eyes closed in concentration, while Julian Vance wrung his hands nervously. When we finally arrived at the discreet mahogany door in St. James's, the mist had grown so thick that the gas lamps appeared as mere ghostly halos in the darkness. A uniformed constable stood guard at the entrance, stepping aside as he recognized Vance. We entered a dimly lit foyer paneled in dark oak, where Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard awaited us near heavy double doors at the corridor's end. His sharp features bore that familiar expression of wry amusement I knew so well. "I might have known you would appear, Poirot," Japp muttered, extending his hand. "A locked room, a poisoned peer, and 10 lawyers as witnesses. It has your signature written all over it." "My good Japp," Poirot replied, carefully unwinding his thick muffler, "it is the psychology of the crime that intrigues me, not merely its mechanics. You have preserved the scene intact?" "Nothing touched since the police surgeon pronounced him dead," Japp confirmed, pushing open the doors. "The 10 survivors are waiting in the library upstairs under guard." We entered the sanctum of the 11th Witness Club. The windowless chamber was illuminated by a grand chandelier, its light falling upon a massive oval table of polished mahogany. 11 high-backed leather chairs surrounded it, each bearing a small brass nameplate. Lord Harrington's body had been removed, but a chalk outline marked where he had collapsed. The crystal decanter sat in the table's center, half filled with ruby port, surrounded by 11 matching glasses. 10 showed evidence of use. The 11th lay overturned, a dark crimson stain spreading across the green baize beneath it. Poirot moved with surprising agility, his eyes darting from the spilled wine to the heavy brass bolts on the door. He examined the lock mechanism minutely, and then walked slowly around the table's perimeter, pausing at each chair to read the nameplates. "The dumbwaiter is there," Japp indicated, pointing to a wooden hatch in the far wall. "I examined it personally. The shaft is barely wide enough for a small dog, certainly not a man." Kitchen staff loaded the refreshments, hoisted them up, and locked the mechanism from below. Harrington unlocked it from this side in full view of his colleagues. Poirot approached the hatch, tapping the wood thoughtfully with his knuckles. "And the port? It was shared by all?" "That's the puzzle, Poirot. We tested the remaining port in the decanter. Completely harmless. We tested the other 10 glasses. Nothing unusual, but Harrington's glass contained traces of potassium cyanide, fast-acting and lethal. Yet how did the poison enter his glass alone?" I asked, stepping closer to examine the overturned vessel. "Precisely the question," Japp said grimly. "No one left their seats. No one approached Harrington. He poured his own drink from the shared decanter, proposed a toast, and died within moments. It defies physical possibility." Poirot hummed softly, a sound of distinct satisfaction. Using silver tongs from a nearby tray, he carefully lifted the overturned glass, holding it to the light and scrutinizing the rim with intense concentration. "Nothing is impossible, mon ami," Poirot murmured. "If something appears impossible, our understanding of events is flawed. We must examine not merely the glass, but the minds of the men who sat around this table." He turned his attention to the chairs, adjusting one slightly to align it perfectly with the table's edge. His obsession with order, even in a crime scene, never ceased to amaze me. "Monsieur Vance," Poirot called without turning around. "Where precisely was Mr. Oliver Grant seated during Lord Harrington's presentation?" Vance pointed with a trembling finger to a chair directly opposite the chalk outline. "There, facing Lord Harrington across the table." "Excellent." Poirot's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity I recognized as the beginning of understanding. The stage is perfectly set, the actors positioned with precision, and the illusion performed to absolute perfection. He straightened his waistcoat with characteristic care. "The cunning murderer wishes us to focus entirely on the mechanics. The poison, the locked room, the shared decanter. But the little grey cells see past such misdirection. The truth lies not in how the poison was administered, but in why Lord Harrington was permitted to speak before he drank. Japp frowned. What do you mean by that? Consider, my friend. A man announces he possesses dangerous knowledge, yet his killer allows him to address 10 witnesses before striking. This suggests either supreme confidence or desperate necessity. Poirot moved toward the door. Come, Hastings. The physical evidence has told us its story. Now we must hear what the human witnesses have to say. As we prepared to leave the chamber, Poirot paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the brass bolt. Tell me, Japp, among these 10 survivors, how many do you suppose had prior knowledge of the High Gables case? More than you might expect, Japp replied darkly. It seems half of legal London had some connection to that cursed house. The remaining members of the 11th Witness Club were assembled in the library, a somber, book-lined sanctuary, whose leather-scented air now carried an unmistakable tension. 10 gentlemen rose as we entered, their faces bearing expressions ranging from dignified composure to barely concealed anxiety. Inspector Japp's heavy footsteps echoed on the Persian carpet as he made the introductions. Gentlemen, this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who is assisting in our inquiries. Poirot stepped forward with characteristic precision, his green eyes sweeping across the assembled faces with the intensity of a naturalist studying rare specimens. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch until it became almost unbearable, and I observed him cataloguing every nervous gesture, every averted glance, every telltale sign of inner turmoil. Monsieur, Poirot began, his voice carrying that peculiar authority I knew so well, I comprehend that you have endured a most severe shock. However, I must ask for your complete cooperation. A colleague has been murdered before your very eyes, and the person responsible remains among us. A tall, silver-haired gentleman with the bearing of a high court judge stepped forward, his face flushing with indignation. I'm Sir Felix Braithwaite, he announced in courtroom tones. To suggest that one of us, men of impeccable legal standing, would resort to such a barbarous act is not merely insulting, but utterly preposterous. Poirot's smile was polite but unyielding. Murder, Sir Felix, does not respect one's professional credentials. The poison was in Lord Harrington's glass alone. No one entered that chamber. Therefore, logic dictates that someone already present introduced the fatal substance. Before Sir Felix could protest further, Poirot raised his hand. You will oblige me by recreating your exact positions from last evening's meeting. The smallest detail may prove significant. There was reluctant shuffling as the men arranged themselves in a rough oval, echoing their formation around the mahogany table below. Sir Felix positioned himself at the imaginary head, while across from him stood a lean, dark-haired man whose sardonic expression suggested familiarity with life's crueler ironies. Mr. Oliver Grant, I presume? Poirot inquired, approaching the man with measured steps. Grant nodded curtly. I am, though I suspect you already knew that. Indeed, you were business associates with the late Adrian Vane, whose mysterious death at High Gables formed the subject of Lord Harrington's presentation. A mining venture in South America, Grant confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. When Vane died, £20,000 vanished along with him. My firm faced severe financial complications. Beside Grant, a distinguished elderly gentleman with military bearing maintained rigid posture. Colonel Ashford, Japp murmured to Poirot. Retired from the Bengal Lancers. He was first to reach Harrington when he collapsed. Instinct, Colonel Ashford explained gruffly. Man falls down, you help him up. Simple as that. Near the fireplace, a mild-mannered gentleman with wire-rimmed spectacles shifted nervously. Dr. Pemberton, he introduced himself. I was seated closest to the decanter last evening. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Ah, yes. You passed the port to Lord Harrington, did you not? He requested it, Pemberton replied, adjusting his spectacles. The decanter stood nearer my place than his. And during this simple transaction, did anyone else handle the vessel? The assembled men exchanged glances. A younger man with nervous eyes spoke up. I may have steadied it when Pemberton lifted it. The table was rather crowded. He identified himself as Mr. Geoffrey Trent, a solicitor from Lincoln's Inn. Poirot hummed thoughtfully, that familiar sound of mental machinery engaging. Tell me, gentlemen, during Lord Harrington's discourse about the High Gables case, how many of you possessed prior knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Mr. Vane's death? The responses came reluctantly. Sir Felix admitted to consulting on a related insurance matter. Lord Yardley had reviewed the coroner's findings. Mr. Edward Morecombe had handled certain property transfers. One by one, it became apparent that nearly half the club had some connection to the original case. Fascinating, Poirot murmured. Lord Harrington believed he was presenting a mystery to fresh minds, yet he was actually addressing an audience of informed participants. Grant's sardonic smile returned. Harrington had a talent for digging into matters best left buried. His curiosity was a loaded pistol forever pointed at someone's head. Indeed, Mr. Grant, you speak as one who had reason to fear that curiosity. I speak as a businessman who values discretion over sensationalism. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze moving from face to face. The murderer counted upon a fundamental truth about human nature. You are all trained to examine facts, not faces. While Lord Harrington spoke, your attention was properly fixed upon him, not upon the hands of your colleagues. The perfect moment for misdirection. He straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. I thank you, monsieur. The little grey cells have much to consider. We withdrew from the library into a smaller anteroom where Poirot immediately began his characteristic ritual of arranging the writing implements on an antique desk with mathematical precision. I recognized the symptoms. When the external world presented chaos, he created order in small things to allow his mind to function at peak efficiency. A most illuminating gathering, Hastings, he murmured. You are adjusting a silver inkwell. 10 men of impeccable legal standing, yet one among them possesses the soul of a calculated killer. You observed their reactions, no doubt. Grant seemed the most hostile, I offered, and Dr. Pemberton appeared genuinely nervous about having handled the decanter. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Excellent observations, but you see only the surface ripples, not the deeper currents beneath. Each man displayed fear, yes, but different varieties of fear entirely. Sir Felix fears for his reputation. Young Trent fears authority itself. Colonel Ashford merely resents the inconvenience. But one man there, mon ami, fears discovery above all else. Before I could respond, Inspector Japp appeared in the doorway. Poirot, there's something you should know. That nervous young solicitor, Trent, he's been holding back information. Indeed? Bring him to us, if you please. Moments later, Geoffrey Trent entered, his pallor even more pronounced than before. His hands trembled as Poirot gestured for him to take a seat, then fixed him with that penetrating stare I knew could unnerve the most hardened criminal. Monsieur Trent, Poirot began, his voice deceptively gentle, you have been less than forthcoming about your connection to this case. You were Mrs. Lucinda Harbury's personal solicitor, were you not? Trent's gasp was audible. How could you possibly know that? I never mentioned her name. You did not need to mention it, Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction. When Monsieur Vance spoke of Mrs. Harbury approaching Lord Harrington, I asked myself, how does a society hostess gain access to such a formidable legal peer? Bun the answer, through her own legal representative. You are the youngest member of this exclusive club, recently admitted. You were her conduit to Lord Harrington. The young man's composure crumbled entirely. Yes, I was her solicitor. She was convinced that Adrian Vane had been murdered at her house. that the missing £20,000 was connected to his death. She couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. She begged me to find someone who could investigate properly. "And yesterday, your client was found dead," Poirot observed. "Most convenient timing." "It was natural causes," Trent protested desperately. Her heart simply gave out. The strain of living under suspicion for months, it destroyed her health. Poirot leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge of steel. "A woman's heart fails the day before her representative is murdered while investigating the very case that tormented her? I do not believe in such convenient coincidences, Monsieur Trent. What did Lord Harrington discover that terrified you so much?" "I didn't kill him," the words burst from Trent's lips. "I swear it on my mother's grave. Yes, I knew he had made discoveries, but he shared nothing with me. He only said he had traced the missing money and that the identity of the 11th witness would change everything. I wanted the truth as much as anyone." Poirot studied the trembling young man for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "You may go, but do not leave London." After Trent departed, I turned to Poirot in bewilderment. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he's frightened, Hastings. But fear and guilt are not always companions. Sometimes fear is merely the shadow of dangerous knowledge." He began pacing with renewed energy. The poison was not administered in any conventional manner. The shared decanter, the watched glasses, all misdirection. The killer relied upon a far more subtle method. "But how, Poirot? Everyone was watching everyone else." "Precisely. And that is the key. While all eyes were upon Lord Harrington as he spoke, no one observed the small actions of their neighbours. A tiny pellet of ice, treated with cyanide, dropped into the glass just as the toast was proposed. By the time Harrington drank, the ice had melted completely, leaving only the poison." I stared at him. "But there was no ice on the table, Poirot." His smile was triumphant. "Exactly, mon ami. And that is the most brilliant clue of all, the absence of what should have been there." Before I could pursue this fascinating line of reasoning, Julian Vance appeared at the door, his face grave with determination. "Monsieur Poirot, I've arranged for a motor to take us to High Gables tonight. As Mrs. Harbury's executor, I have keys to the house. If we leave within the hour, we can be there by 11. "Excellent," Poirot replied, reaching for his coat. "The scene here has told us much, but the true beginning of this tragedy lies in Surrey. 3 deaths connected to one house. We must understand the first to properly see the last." The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets was accomplished in contemplative silence. As we left the city's lights behind, entering the dark countryside of Surrey, Poirot sat rigidly wrapped in his greatcoat, not occasionally murmuring questions to Vance about Mrs. Harbury's changed behavior after Vane's death. "She became a different woman entirely," Vance explained. "Once she loved entertaining, surrounding herself with clever people. After that terrible weekend, she dismissed most of her servants and rarely left the house. She kept saying, 'They will not let me rest, Julian. The voices are always there at night.' And yet she summoned Lord Harrington to reopen the very wound that tormented her," Poirot mused. "A fascinating contradiction." High Gables revealed itself gradually through the mist. First the tall chimneys, then the steep gabled roofline, finally the imposing Victorian facade of dark stone. 2 weathered stone lions flanked the gravel drive, their features worn smooth by decades of Surrey weather. As I brought the motor to a halt before the front steps, an elderly man with stooped shoulders opened the heavy oak door. His craggy face showed relief at the sight of Vance. "Thank God you've come, sir. I don't like being here alone, not after what happened to the mistress." He noticed us and straightened. "Name's Barnes, sir. Been caretaker here since Mrs. Harbury passed." Poirot stepped delicately past him into the hall, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The space rose 2 stories, panelled in dark wood, with a staircase that branched halfway up like a question mark. Portraits of stern-faced Harburys lined the walls. "You were in service here during Mr. Vane's fatal visit?" Poirot asked immediately. Yes, sir. Footman then. I was serving in the dining room the night he died. Poirot removed his hat with slow deliberation, his green eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity that meant the hunt was truly beginning. Then, Barnes, he said quietly, you are precisely the man I most wished to meet. Barnes led us through the dimly lit corridors of high Gables, his footsteps muffled by worn Persian runners. The air held that peculiar quality of houses long troubled by tragedy, watchful, oppressive, and faintly resentful of intrusion. Electric lights had been installed recently, but their harsh glare only emphasized the shadows that seemed to lurk in every corner. It was the 6th of May when Mr. Vane came down for the weekend, Barnes began, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the last grand house parties Mrs. Harbury ever gave. 12 guests in total, including Mr. Oliver Grant and Sir Felix Braithwaite, the gentleman you met tonight in London. Poirot walked with characteristic precision, his hands clasped behind his back. You will describe that final evening in detail, if you please. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of tension. There was tension aplenty, sir. During dinner, Mr. Vane was in unusually high spirits, almost reckless, I'd say. He made pointed remarks about South American investments, about money that had a way of disappearing in foreign ventures. Mr. Grant went white as a sheet, then said something sharp about temporary losses being recovered in unexpected ways. We had reached the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. Barnes set his lamp upon a reading table, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Mr. Vane retired here after dinner, claiming a headache. He carried his briefcase, said it contained documents that would interest several people greatly. I brought him brandy at 10:30. He was writing letters at that desk there, seemed quite satisfied with himself. Poirot examined the heavy oak desk minutely. And in the morning, I found him at 7, sir, lying on the Persian rug beside the window. The casement was wide open, the briefcase empty on the floor, £20,000 in bearer bonds. Vanished completely. Before Poirot could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hall, followed by a sharp rapping at the front door. Barnes hurried away, returning moments later with a robust man in a thick overcoat who brought the night's chill with him. Inspector Davies, Surrey Constabulary, the newcomer announced, eyeing us with obvious suspicion. Mr. Vance, I saw the lights from the road. Excellent timing. I have news that will interest you greatly. Poirot stepped forward with a polite bow. I am Hercule Poirot, assisting Scotland Yard with a related matter in London. Davies' face brightened with triumph. Well, Mr. Poirot, you can return to London with a clear conscience. I've solved the High Gables mystery. Thomas Briggs, the former gardener, was arrested an hour ago in Guildford. We found him spending crisp new banknotes at the Lamb and Flag, buying drinks for half the pub. He confessed to being in the grounds that night, forced the window, stole the bonds, and poor Vane died of the shock. Julian Vance exhaled deeply. Then Lord Harrington's death was merely coincidental? Precisely, Davies declared. No, your London troubles are separate entirely. Briggs had the money, he had opportunity, and he's confessed to the theft. Case closed. I looked at Poirot, expecting satisfaction at this resolution. Instead, the little Belgian detective was regarding the inspector with an expression of profound pity. You have found a thief, Inspector Davies, Poirot said quietly, but you have not found a murderer. You have merely discovered a scavenger who happened upon a convenient opportunity. Davies bristled. The facts are perfectly clear, Mr. Poirot. The bonds were stolen. Briggs has the money. Did you ask him whether the window was already open when he arrived? Poirot interrupted. The inspector hesitated. He claimed it was unlatched, but criminals always minimize their guilt. Indeed they do, Poirot agreed, but with purpose and logic. A gardener knows these grounds intimately. He understands the household routines, the servants' schedules. But a gardener does not know the contents of a guest's private briefcase. A gardener does not understand the intricacies of South American mining investments. Poirot moved to the open window, examining the latch mechanism with intense concentration. Your Mr. Briggs saw an opportunity and seized it. An open window, a dead man, a briefcase full of negotiable bonds. But the window was opened from inside this room, Inspector. Someone in this house that night wanted the world to believe in an external intruder. He turned back to face us, his green eyes blazing with certainty. The true architect of this tragedy walked among Mrs. Harbury's guests, dined at her table, and has now killed twice more to protect their secret. Tomorrow, we shall discover which of our London acquaintances opened this window 6 months ago. Inspector Davies returned at dawn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel as he approached High Gables with renewed confidence. His ruddy face bore the satisfaction of a man who believed he had solved an impossible puzzle through simple, methodical police work. "Well, Mr. Poirot," he announced as he entered the library where we had assembled for breakfast, "I've had another session with Briggs. The man's story holds perfectly. He saw the open window, climbed through, found Vane dead on the floor, and helped himself to the bonds. Natural opportunity for a man of his character." Poirot looked up from his careful arrangement of the morning tea service, each cup positioned with mathematical precision. "You are satisfied, then, that Mr. Briggs murdered Adrian Vane?" "Murder?" Davies snorted. "Vane died of shock, pure and simple. Weak heart, sudden fright at seeing an intruder. Briggs admits he may have startled him, but there's no evidence of violence." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, rising to examine the fireplace with renewed interest. "Yet I find it curious that a man who died of fright managed to open a window he habitually kept closed, even in summer." Barnes, who had been silently serving our breakfast, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Mr. Poirot speaks truly. Mr. Vane had a horror of draughts, kept every window sealed tight, even complained when other guests opened theirs." Davies waved dismissively. "Fear makes men do strange things. Perhaps he heard something on the terrace." "From his bedroom upstairs?" Poirot's green eyes glinted with that familiar intensity. "For that is where Mr. Vane retired at 11 o'clock, according to your own witness statements. Yet Barnes found him dead in this library at 7 the next morning. Someone came down in the night, Inspector. Someone opened that window from inside this room." While Davies sputtered protests, Poirot knelt beside the great fireplace, using silver tongs to extract something from behind the iron grate. When he stood, he held a fragment of charred parchment, its edges blackened, but several words still legible. "Observe, Monsieur," he said quietly, placing the fragment on the leather-topped desk. "Thrown into the fire on the night Vane died, but the draught carried it upward. I'm preserving these words. Must confess the truth about the South American. Cannot let him ruin. The 11th Witness saw." Julian Vance gasped. "The 11th Witness? But that's—" "The name of your London club, precisely," Poirot confirmed. "This fragment suggests that someone at High Gables that weekend knew of Vane's dangerous knowledge and feared its exposure. Tell me, Monsieur Vance, who exactly were Mrs. Harbury's guests during that fatal gathering?" Vance's face had grown pale as understanding dawned. "Good God, Poirot. Oliver Grant was here, certainly. Sir Felix Braithwaite came down from London. Lord Yardley arrived Friday evening. Dr. Pemberton was treating Mrs. Harbury's nerves. Colonel Ashford came for the shooting. The same gentlemen who now sit in your exclusive club," I observed with growing amazement. "Ah, not all," Vance continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were others. Mrs. Vane, Lucinda's cousin Lydia, the Markhams, the Elstons. But the core group—" He trailed off, the implications overwhelming him. Poirot nodded with grim satisfaction. "A closed circle, Hastings. The same men who witnessed Vane's death 6 months ago witnessed Lord Harrington's murder 3 nights past. One among them opened that window, destroyed evidence in the fire, and has now killed twice more to protect their secret. Inspector Davies had been listening with growing frustration. "This is all very theatrical, Mr. Poirot, but I have a confession and stolen money. That's evidence enough for any court." "You have a scavenger, Inspector, not a murderer," Poirot replied firmly, "but your Briggs may yet prove useful. Now, when did he first notice the open window? Was it already unlatched when he approached the house?" Davies hesitated. He claimed it was standing open when he arrived, but criminals always minimize their involvement. "Or perhaps," Poirot suggested, "this criminal spoke the simple truth. The window was opened by someone inside this house, someone who wanted the world to believe in an external intruder." The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing the formal gardens of High Gables in sharp detail. Poirot stood at the library window, his gaze fixed on the stone terrace where footprints might once have told their story. "We return to London immediately," he announced suddenly. "The answers we seek lie not in this house of memories, but in the minds of living men. I shall invite certain gentlemen to my flat this afternoon. We will present them with a carefully constructed fiction and observe how guilt betrays itself." By 3 o'clock, the atmosphere in Poirot's sitting room was thick with unspoken tension. Julian Vance sat rigidly beside Oliver Grant, whose sardonic mask seemed more brittle than usual. Sir Felix Braithwaite occupied the leather armchair with judicial dignity, while Geoffrey Trent hovered near the window, his pale hands twisting his watch chain nervously. "I thank you for coming, monsieur," Poirot began, his voice carrying that deceptive gentleness I knew could be more dangerous than shouting. "I have news from Surrey. Inspector Davies has arrested the gardener Briggs for stealing Adrian Vane's bonds." "Then the matter is concluded," Sir Felix declared with obvious relief. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken," Poirot continued smoothly. "Briggs is merely a thief who found an opportunity. The true architect of this tragedy was inside High Gables that night, and Mrs. Harbury knew their identity." The room fell silent, except for the gentle hiss of the fire. I watched each man's face as Poirot had instructed, noting every flicker of expression, every telltale gesture. Before her death, Poirot said quietly, "Mrs. Harbury wrote a final letter detailing what she witnessed. Lord Harrington intended to read this letter to your club, but the killer acted first, dropping poisoned ice into his glass, while all attention was focused on his presentation." Grant shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the door. Trent had stopped fidgeting entirely, frozen like a startled animal. "Or the murderer made one fatal error," Poirot continued, moving to his desk with deliberate precision. "They assumed Lord Harrington brought the original letter to the club, but he was a cautious man. He brought only a copy. The original, written in Mrs. Harbury's own hand, was posted to my flat for safekeeping." He placed a sealed envelope on the table between them, his green eyes scanning their faces with predatory intensity. "I have not yet opened it," he murmured. "I thought it proper to read it in the presence of those most intimately connected to the South American venture that cost Adrian Vane his life." The silence stretched unbearably. Then Oliver Grant stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "This is an outrage," he burst out. "You're trying to trap us with theatrical tricks, and I had nothing to do with Vane's death or Harrington's murder." "I made no accusation, Monsieur Grant," Poirot replied with deadly calm. "I merely proposed to read a letter, yet you react with the violence of a man who feels the noose tightening around his neck. The trap was set, the bait irresistible." As Poirot gestured for me to accompany him to fetch tea, leaving the envelope tantalizingly within reach, I knew we were moments away from witnessing the final act of this carefully orchestrated drama. The mouse could not resist the cheese, especially when he believed the trap was unguarded. We retreated to the adjoining breakfast alcove, leaving the door strategically ajar. Poirot arranged the tea service with his characteristic precision, each cup positioned with mathematical exactitude, as yet his green eyes remained fixed on the narrow gap through which we could observe our guests. "You think one of them will take the bait?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I do not think, Hastings. I rely upon the fundamental nature of guilt, Poirot murmured, adjusting a teaspoon by the smallest fraction. A man who has killed twice to protect his secret will not permit what he believes to be damning evidence to exist. His very desperation will betray him. Through the doorway, we could hear the strained voices of our guests. Sir Felix's judicial tones carried clearly. Really, Grant, your agitation serves no purpose. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from any letter. You don't understand the implications. Grant's voice was harsh, strained. Harrington was building a case based on speculation and coincidence. And if that woman's letter supports his theories, then perhaps, came Geoffrey Trent's nervous interruption, we should wait for Monsieur Poirot's return before anyone examines it. It would appear most improper if... The young solicitor's words were cut short by the unmistakable rustle of paper. Someone had picked up the envelope. Poirot moved with swift precision, stepping through the doorway just as Oliver Grant's hand extended toward the blazing fireplace, the white envelope clutched between his fingers. "Non, monsieur," Poirot said sharply. "You will oblige me by not destroying what does not belong to you." Grant froze, caught in the act, his face flushing crimson. For an instant, his carefully maintained composure cracked entirely, revealing something desperate and cornered beneath. "It slipped from the table," he stammered. I was merely attempting to cast it into the flames." Poirot's eyebrows rose in delicate disbelief. "Your reflexes are most unusual, Monsieur Grant. They move not toward safety, but toward destruction." Sir Felix had risen from his chair, his expression one of judicial disapproval. "Grant, your behavior is becoming increasingly difficult to defend." Julian Vance stared in bewilderment. "Oliver, surely you cannot believe that destroying evidence would solve anything." "Evidence?" Grant laughed bitterly. "You call the hysterical ramblings of a guilt-ridden woman evidence. Lucinda Harbury was half-mad with grief and suspicion." Poirot retrieved the envelope with ceremonial care, placing it upon the center table. His green eyes swept across each face with predatory intensity. "Messieurs," he announced quietly, I must confess something to you. This envelope contains nothing but a blank sheet of notepaper." The room erupted in startled exclamations. Grant's face went white. "What?" "A blank sheet," Poirot repeated serenely. "There was no letter from Mrs. Harbury, no written confession, no posted evidence. I created this entire performance to observe how each of you would react when confronted with the possibility of exposure." "You tricked us," Grant burst out, his voice cracking. "Naturally," Poirot agreed, "and most instructively." Sir Felix remained calm, secure in his innocence. Monsieur Vance showed concern but no panic. But you, Monsieur Grant, attempted immediately to destroy what you believed could condemn you. Geoffrey Trent had been standing frozen near the window, his face pale as parchment. Now he stepped forward, and his voice trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something I must tell you, something I should have revealed long ago." All eyes turned to the young solicitor. Poirot nodded encouragingly. "Speak freely, mon ami." "At High Gables, on the night Mr. Vane died, I overheard a conversation on the terrace. I had stepped outside to smoke, and I heard voices from the library window. Mr. Vane was speaking to Mr. Grant." Grant made a violent movement. "This is preposterous. I will not—" "Please," Trent continued, his voice gaining strength. Mr. Vane was laughing, that cruel, triumphant laugh people have when they hold power over someone. He said, "You thought those bearer bonds were invisible, Oliver. But I have the numbers, the signatures, the complete transfer trail. So one word from me and your entire scheme collapses." The room had fallen deadly silent. Grant's face had assumed a mottled, dangerous hue. "And Mr. Grant replied," Trent pressed on. "He said, 'You won't talk. You're too fond of money yourself. Besides, who would believe you took it? They all trust the 11th Witness, the impartial observer.' But Mr. Vane laughed again and said, 'Oh, they'll believe me when I lay it all before the club. Braithwaite, Yardley, the whole legal establishment. They won't shield you once they understand what you really are. Why didn't you report this at the time? I demanded. Trent's voice cracked with emotion. Because by morning, Mr. Vane was dead. Everyone was speaking of burglary, of external intruders, and I... He looked around the room desperately. I was terrified. These men controlled my career and my future. I convinced myself I had misunderstood, that it meant nothing. Poirot had been listening with intense concentration. Now he spoke, his voice carrying absolute certainty. But it meant everything, did it not, Monsieur Grant? Adrian Vane had discovered your embezzlement of the South American mining funds. He possessed documentary evidence of your theft. And when he threatened to expose you before your peers, men whose respect and trust were essential to your continued success, you realized he had to be silenced. Grant's laugh was harsh and bitter. Conjecture, hearsay. You have nothing but the fevered imagination of a frightened boy and your own theatrical tricks. On the contrary, Poirot replied calmly, I have something far more damning, your own behavior. An innocent man would have demanded to read that letter immediately. Confident in his vindication, a guilty man attempts to destroy it before its contents can be revealed. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in that familiar posture of deep contemplation. Tomorrow we shall visit the banks, examine the financial records, trace those bearer bonds Monsieur Tron mentioned. Numbers and signatures leave trails as clear as footprints in snow. But the case is already solved, Monsieur. Psychology has revealed the truth that evidence will merely confirm. Grant stood abruptly, his composure finally shattered completely. You think you're so clever, don't you, Poirot, with your little grey cells and your theatrical games? But you have proved nothing, nothing that would stand before any competent court. Perhaps not yet, Poirot agreed with terrifying calm. But I have identified the murderer. The rest is merely a matter of gathering the physical proof that will satisfy the law's requirements. He turned back to face us, his expression grave but determined. We shall reconvene tomorrow evening, Monsieur, not here in my modest flat, but in a setting more appropriate for the final revelation of crimes conceived in such elegant surroundings. I believe the library of your club would be most fitting, the scene where Lord Harrington met his end, and where justice will finally be served. The psychological trap had been sprung, the guilty party identified through his own desperate actions. As our guests departed into the fog-shrouded London evening, I knew that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had once again penetrated to the heart of human darkness, using the murderer's own psychology as the instrument of his detection. The morning brought a sharp November frost that coated London's pavements with crystalline precision, a detail that would have pleased Poirot's sense of order had his mind not been entirely occupied with more pressing matters. I found him in his sitting room at dawn, fully dressed and arranging his breakfast service with mathematical exactitude, each piece positioned to achieve perfect symmetry. You are up early, Poirot, I observed, noting the intensity of concentration in his green eyes. The mind, she does not sleep when presented with such an elegant puzzle, Hastings, he replied, making a minute adjustment to his coffee cup. Today we examine the financial evidence that will either confirm or destroy our theories, and Inspector Japp awaits us at the National and Provincial Bank. The trail of money. The imposing stone facade of the bank rose before us in the crisp morning air, where Japp stood ready with the necessary warrants tucked securely in his breast pocket. His breath formed small clouds as he spoke with barely contained excitement. We have the authorization to examine Grant's private accounts, Poirot. If he deposited those stolen bearer bonds, the paper trail will hang him. Poirot adjusted his muffler with characteristic precision before responding. Do not be overly confident, mon ami. A mind capable of orchestrating murder in a locked room does not simply deposit stolen funds in his local bank account. The manager's office was a study in mahogany and leather, redolent of expensive cigars and old money. For 3 hours, We pored over ledgers, examining transfer documents and deposit records with the methodical thoroughness that such investigations demanded. Japp traced the serial numbers of the missing bonds with growing confusion, his triumphant expression slowly transforming into bewilderment. "This makes no sense whatsoever," the inspector muttered, running his finger down columns of figures. "Grant's accounts are severely overdrawn. The man is practically ruined financially. There is absolutely no trace of the £20,000 from High Gables." I leaned forward, studying the documents. If he murdered Vane for that money, where could he have hidden it? Poirot, who had been examining a separate collection of routine correspondence with his silver magnifying glass, suddenly stiffened with that peculiar intensity I knew so well. Though his attention was fixed not on the financial ledgers, but on a simple calendar of club events and a list of authorized signatories for various institutional accounts. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, his voice carrying a note of profound revelation. "The absolute brilliance of it, Hastings. We have been examining the tapestry from the wrong side, seeing only the tangled threads while missing the magnificent pattern on the front. The great misdirection." "Have you found the money?" I asked eagerly. "I have found something infinitely more valuable, mon ami. I have found the truth." Poirot carefully returned the document to its precise position on the desk. "The little grey cells have finally arranged all the pieces into their proper configuration." He rose abruptly, retrieving his hat and walking stick. "Come, we have learned what we came to discover. Mr. Grant's financial ruin is merely a symptom of a much larger disease." Japp protested vigorously as we descended the bank's marble steps. "But what about Grant's reaction to your fake letter yesterday? He practically confessed to being blackmailed by Vane." "Mr. Grant is indeed a thief and an embezzler," Poirot replied with calm certainty. "He stole from the South American venture, and Vane discovered his crime. Grant is guilty of many transgressions, Inspector, but he is not our murderer. He is merely the perfect screen behind which the true killer has been operating." I stared at him in complete astonishment. "Not the murderer. But we heard Trent's testimony about their argument." "Because Grant believed any letter from Mrs. Harbury would contain proof of his embezzlement," Poirot explained patiently. "He thought Vane's death was a fortunate accident that miraculously saved him from exposure. When Lord Harrington began investigating, Grant panicked. But consider this crucial point, Hastings. If Grant possessed the poison and planned the murder, why would he choose a method requiring him to sit directly opposite his victim, where every movement could be observed by 10 witnesses? The evening gathering. We returned to Whitehaven Mansions, where Poirot spent the afternoon in deep contemplation, building elaborate card houses with incredible precision. I knew better than to interrupt this delicate process of mental organization. "The poisoned ice, Hastings," he said suddenly, placing a final card atop his fragile architectural creation. We assumed the killer dropped it into the glass during the toast. But what if the ice was already positioned? What if the glass itself was prepared in advance? But they all used identical glasses from the same service, I counted. "Precisely," Poirot smiled with satisfaction. "Identical glasses, a shared decanter, 10 witnesses. Tonight at the club, I shall demonstrate how a man can be murdered in plain sight, not because the killer was invisible, but because he was so perfectly visible that no one thought to observe him closely." The fog had thickened by evening when we arrived at the 11th Witness. The same discreet mahogany door, the same panelled corridors, but tonight the atmosphere carried a weight of impending revelation. The surviving members had assembled in the library, rising as we entered with expressions ranging from dignified composure to barely concealed anxiety. Sir Felix Braithwaite maintained his judicial bearing, while Oliver Grant's sardonic mask seemed more brittle than usual. Geoffrey Trent hovered near the windows, his pale hands betraying his nervousness. Dr. Pemberton fidgeted with his spectacles, and Colonel Ashford stood at military attention. Lord Yardley's aristocratic composure appeared strained. while Julian Vance bore the burden of conflicted loyalties. The psychological web. Monsieur, Poirot began, his voice carrying that deceptive gentleness that could prove more dangerous than shouting, "You formed this club to examine mysteries that conventional investigation had failed to resolve. Tonight, can we examine the greatest mystery of all, the darkness that can lurk within the human heart, even among men of the highest reputation?" He moved to the great table where Lord Harrington had died, his hands resting lightly on the polished surface. 3 deaths, all connected to High Gables and to this very circle. Adrian Vane, Lucinda Harbury, Lord Harrington. Each death, considered separately, might be explained by coincidence. Together, they form a pattern that only deliberate design could create. Grant's laugh was sharp and defensive. "You speak as though we're characters in some melodramatic fiction. Yet it is life, not fiction, that has brought us to this moment," Poirot replied mildly. "The method employed to kill Lord Harrington was chosen specifically to create an illusion of impossibility. A shared decanter, identical glasses, a locked chamber, yet only one man dies. The police discover cyanide in his glass alone. It appears miraculous, but miracles do not interest me. Human psychology does." He allowed his gaze to sweep the assembled faces, measuring each reaction with predatory precision. "The cyanide was not in the port," he continued quietly. "It was delivered via a small pellet of frozen water, carefully prepared and positioned in advance, but not dropped during the toast, as we first assumed. The ice was already in place, waiting for the precise moment when Lord Harrington would raise that particular glass to his lips." The room had fallen deadly silent, except for the soft hiss of the gas lamps and the distant sound of carriages on the street below. "Tomorrow evening," Poirot announced, straightening his tie with fastidious care, "I shall gather you all once more, not here, but in a setting that will allow me to demonstrate exactly how this seemingly impossible crime was accomplished, and by whom. The little grey cells have solved the puzzle, messieurs. Now comes the moment of truth." As our companions departed into the fog-shrouded London night, I knew that Hercule Poirot had set the stage for the final, devastating revelation that would expose not just a murderer, but the intricate web of deception that had made 3 deaths appear as separate tragedies rather than the connected crimes they truly were. The following evening brought a thick London fog that seemed to muffle the very heartbeat of the city. The gas lamps of St. James's flickered like dying stars as we approached the discreet entrance of the 11th Witness Club. And Poirot emerged from our hansom with unusual gravity, his green eyes holding that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with the final moments of his most complex cases. The club's library had been arranged exactly as it was on the night of Lord Harrington's death. The massive mahogany table dominated the windowless chamber, its polished surface reflecting the brilliant light of the chandelier above. 10 leather chairs stood in their precise positions around the table, while the 11th, Lord Harrington's chair, remained conspicuously empty, marked by the chalk outline on the Persian carpet beneath. The final gathering. Inspector Japp positioned himself near the heavy double doors, their brass bolts gleaming in the lamplight. The surviving members of the 11th Witness had assembled reluctantly, and each man cloaked in his own particular manner of concealing anxiety. Sir Felix Braithwaite maintained his judicial bearing near the fireplace, while Oliver Grant sat rigidly at a side table, his sardonic mask more brittle than ever. Geoffrey Trent hovered beside the bookshelf, Dr. Pemberton fidgeted with his spectacles, and Colonel Ashford stood at military attention. Lord Yardley's aristocratic composure appeared strained, while Julian Vance stood apart by the long windows, his face bearing the weight of a man who had orchestrated this very gathering. "Messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying that deceptive gentleness that could prove more dangerous than thunder. "We have reached the conclusion of an investigation that began not 3 nights ago in this room, but 6 months ago in the library of High Gables. 3 deaths, and all connected by threads invisible to the casual observer, but clear as daylight to the little grey cells. He moved to the head of the table, his hand resting lightly on the back of Lord Harrington's empty chair. "Let us begin with what appears most obvious. Monsieur Grant, you are indeed guilty of embezzlement from the South American mining venture. Adrian Vane discovered your crime and threatened exposure. The argument young Monsieur Trent overheard on the terrace was genuine, but it did not end in murder." Grant's face flushed, but he remained silent as Poirot continued with inexorable logic. "You, Monsieur Grant, lacked the nerve for murder then. When morning revealed Vane's death, you were as startled as anyone. The convenient appearance of burglary seemed a providential escape from ruin. Now you were content to let sleeping dogs lie until Lord Harrington began his investigation. The elimination of false leads." Poirot began his characteristic pacing around the table's perimeter, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "Dr. Pemberton, your nervous handling of the port decanter that fatal night made you appear suspicious. But a man planning murder does not draw attention to himself by displaying obvious anxiety. Your guilt lies elsewhere, in your treatment of Mrs. Harbury's genuine distress, perhaps, but not in murder." He paused behind each chair as he spoke, his green eyes measuring every reaction with predatory precision. "Sir Felix, Lord Yardley, Colonel Ashford, each of you had some connection to the original High Gables case, and yet none possessed both the opportunity and the desperate motive required for such elaborate crimes. The killer needed intimate knowledge of all three victims, access to their private spaces, and above all, the psychological cunning to manipulate the investigation itself." The revelation. Poirot stopped behind Julian Vance, who stood perfectly still by the windows, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the fog-shrouded street. "Monsieur Vance," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "you came to my flat in apparent distress, begging for assistance in solving Lord Harrington's murder. A brilliant performance, establishing yourself as the concerned friend desperate for truth. But it was you who controlled this club's finances. It was you who had secretly depleted the charitable foundation's accounts to cover disastrous investments of your own." The room fell into stunned silence. Vance's reflection in the window glass showed no surprise, only the weary resignation of a man whose elaborate deception had finally been penetrated. "When Adrian Vane brought those bearer bonds to High Gables," Poirot continued, his voice rising with controlled power, "you saw your salvation. £20,000, exactly what you needed to replace the missing foundation funds before the annual audit. You entered the library that night under the guise of discussing club business. Vane knew you, trusted you. Perhaps you even shared a drink while you convinced him to open his briefcase." Poirot moved to the center of the table, his hand resting near the crystal decanter that had played such a crucial role in the final murder. "You killed him, perhaps with the very poison you would later use on Lord Harrington, then took the bonds and opened the window from inside to suggest an external intruder. The gardener Briggs became your unwitting accomplice when he discovered the scene and helped himself to what he thought were the proceeds of his own burglary." The method revealed. "But Mrs. Harbury began to suspect," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Her nerves were not grief, but fear. She knew you were the last person to see Vane alive. As the club's secretary and her legal advisor, you had keys to High Gables. A simple matter to visit her one final time, to administer the same poison that had silenced Vane." Inspector Japp leaned forward from his position by the door. "And Lord Harrington?" Poirot's smile was grim with satisfaction. Lord Harrington was the most dangerous threat of all. His investigation had traced the bearer bonds to their final destination, not a private account, but the charitable foundation managed by Monsieur Vance. He intended to present his findings to this very club, to expose the man they all trusted as their secretary and treasurer. He picked up one of the crystal glasses from the table, holding it up to the chandelier's light. The locked room, the shared decanter, the 10 witnesses, all perfect misdirection, We assumed the poison was in the port or delivered via ice, but the cyanide was painted onto the rim of Lord Harrington's specific glass, dissolved in a clear sugar solution that dried invisibly. When he drank, the wine reconstituted the poison instantly. But how could you ensure he received that particular glass? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. Because Hastings, as club secretary, Monsieur Vance arranged this very room before each meeting. He knew exactly where Lord Harrington always sat, at the head of the table, in the position of honor. He simply placed the prepared glass at that specific location, knowing his victim's habits with absolute certainty. The psychological trap. Poirot turned to face Vance directly, his voice carrying a note of profound sadness mixed with inexorable justice. Your greatest error, Monsieur Vance, was in bringing me into the case at all. You thought the great detective would provide your ultimate alibi. Who would suspect the man who summoned Hercule Poirot to solve the mystery? But you underestimated the little grey cells. They do not provide alibis for murderers. They demand justice for the dead. Julian Vance finally turned from the window, his face a mask of exhausted defeat. The fog outside seemed to swirl around his reflection like the ghosts of his victims. It was the only way, he said quietly, his voice devoid of all emotion. The foundation audit was approaching. If the missing funds had been discovered, my entire career would have been destroyed. Everything I had built over 30 years, gone. When Vane brought those bonds to High Gables, I saw my chance. One death to save my reputation seemed reasonable. And when that one death led to 2 more, Poirot asked sternly. Vance's laugh was bitter and hollow. Each death made the next one necessary. Mrs. Harbury's suspicions, Lord Harrington's investigation, they were threads that would unravel everything if left unpulled. I thought if you cleared me, no one would ever question it again. Justice served. Inspector Japp stepped forward, producing the warrant from his breast pocket. Julian Vance, I arrest you for the murders of Adrian Vane, Lucinda Harbury, and Lord Harrington. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Vance looked around the room one final time at the men who had been his colleagues and friends. I preserved the Foundation's reputation, he said with a trace of his former dignity. The charitable work will continue. Perhaps that counts for something. 3 lives, Monsieur Vance, Poirot replied with quiet finality. Mas, that is what your reputation cost. I think you will find the accounting does not balance in your favor. As Vance was led away into the fog-shrouded London night, the remaining members of the 11th Witness sat in stunned silence. Their exclusive club, formed to examine unsolved mysteries, had become the scene of the most elaborate deception any of them had ever encountered. Poirot gathered his hat and walking stick with characteristic precision. The affair at the 11th Witness is concluded, messieurs, but perhaps you will remember that the greatest mysteries often lie not in locked rooms or missing weapons, but in the human heart itself, where greed and fear can transform even the most respectable gentleman into a calculating killer. With that observation, Hercule Poirot stepped into the November fog, now leaving behind a room full of men who would never again look at their colleagues with quite the same trust, knowing that beneath the most polished exterior could lurk the soul of a murderer. The little grey cells had once again triumphed, not through the examination of physical evidence, but through the careful analysis of human psychology, revealing that the most dangerous criminal is often the one who appears most eager to help solve the very crimes he has committed. The fire crackled peacefully in the grate at Whitehaven Mansions as London settled into another fog-shrouded evening. 3 weeks had passed since Julian Vance's arrest, and the newspapers had finally turned their attention from the 11th Witness murders to more pressing matters of state. Hercule Poirot sat in his favorite armchair, meticulously arranging his evening tea service with mathematical precision, each piece positioned to achieve perfect symmetry. The trial concluded today, Inspector Japp announced as he entered our sitting room, removing his damp overcoat. Guilty on all 3 counts. The jury deliberated barely an hour. I poured Japp a cup of tea, noting how the inspector's usually jovial demeanor had been sobered by the case. What of the others? Grant, young Trent, the surviving club members. Grant will face charges for embezzlement, though nothing like the gallows, Japp replied, settling heavily into his chair. His theft from the South American venture was real enough, but as you proved, Poirot, he lacked the nerve for murder. Trent's testimony was crucial. The lad found his courage in the end. Poirot nodded with quiet satisfaction. And the unfortunate gardener. Briggs? 6 months for theft. He was indeed merely a scavenger who stumbled upon opportunity. The real tragedy lies elsewhere entirely. The psychology of respectability. Poirot adjusted his waistcoat with characteristic precision before speaking. Julian Vance presented himself as the very embodiment of English legal virtue. Trusted secretary, charitable administrator, pillar of society. Yet beneath that impeccable exterior lurked a man who valued reputation above human life. It's the ones you least suspect, I observed, who prove most dangerous. Non, mon ami, Poirot corrected gently. It is precisely the ones we most trust who possess the greatest capacity for evil. Respectability is not merely a cloak for wickedness, it is the perfect weapon. Who questions the man who summons the detective? Who suspects the colleague who arranges the meeting room? Vance understood that visibility can be the ultimate invisibility. Japp leaned forward, still puzzled by certain aspects of the case. But why invite you at all, Poirot? Surely he knew the risk. Because he believed he had constructed the perfect impossible crime, Poirot explained, his green eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. The locked room, the shared decanter, the 10 witnesses, all designed to convince me that no human agency could be responsible. He expected Hercule Poirot to declare the murder unsolvable, thereby providing him with the ultimate alibi. The deeper truth. Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street where gas lamps flickered like dying stars. The true tragedy, Monsieur, lies not in Vance's crimes, but in his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. He created the 11th Witness Club to examine mysteries, to apply legal minds to unsolved cases. Yet he forgot the most important witness of all, the conscience. When that voice is silenced, there remains only the poor Hercule Poirot to speak in its place. What will become of the club? I asked. It is disbanded, Japp confirmed. The surviving members cannot bear to meet in that chamber where their trusted colleague poisoned Lord Harrington before their very eyes. Sir Felix has resigned from the bench, claiming his judgment has been permanently compromised. Dr. Pemberton speaks of retiring to the country. Now they have learned that evil can wear the face of the man who passes the port with an irreproachable hand. The final lesson. Poirot returned to his chair, straightening a silver ornament on the side table that was perhaps a millimeter out of alignment. Murder is a demanding master, Hastings. Once a man crosses that terrible threshold, he finds the door locks behind him. Vance's first crime, killing Adrian Vane for those bearer bonds, created an inexorable chain of necessity. Mrs. Harbury knew too much. Lord Harrington discovered too much. Each death made the next inevitable, until finally the weight of his deceptions crushed him entirely. Yet he showed no remorse, I reflected. Even at the end, he spoke only of preserving the Foundation's reputation. Because he had confused the work with the worker, or the cause with his own image, Poirot replied sadly. When a man builds his life upon the reflection others have of him, the bare thought of that image shattered becomes unbearable. Then he will commit any folly, any crime, to preserve it. The room fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas played out in its fog-shrouded streets. And now, Poirot announced, reaching for his evening chocolate with evident satisfaction, The little grey cells have earned their rest. Order has been restored to a world temporarily thrown into chaos by one man's supreme arrogance. Justice has been served, though at a price that makes even victory taste of ashes. As the fire settled into glowing embers, I reflected that though murder, greed, and vanity might flourish in the world beyond these walls, within Poirot's immaculate sitting room, reason and justice still held their eternal, uncompromising ground. The pale April sunshine streamed through the windows of Whitehaven mansions, casting geometric patterns across Hercule Poirot's immaculate carpet. 6 weeks had passed since Julian Vance's trial concluded, and London had largely forgotten the sensation of the 11th Witness murders. Yet as Poirot arranged his morning correspondence with mathematical precision, I sensed that his little grey cells remained troubled by some unresolved aspect of the case. George announced Sir Felix Braithwaite with characteristic discretion. The former High Court judge entered bearing the weight of resignation and self-doubt, his once commanding presence diminished by the revelation of how thoroughly he had been deceived by a trusted colleague. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Felix began, settling heavily into the offered chair, I come to you with a matter that torments not only my conscience, but the future of countless innocent souls. The charitable foundation Vance administered faces complete ruin. Despite the most thorough police investigation, the £20,000 in bearer bonds has never been recovered. The widows and orphans who depended upon our trust will be destitute within months. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with that familiar intensity. You assume, Sir Felix, that a man who committed 3 murders to preserve his reputation as a benevolent administrator would simply hoard stolen wealth for personal enrichment. What else could he have done with it? I interjected, genuinely puzzled. Ah, Hastings, you observe the crime, but miss the criminal's psychology entirely, Poirot replied, moving to his desk with characteristic precision. He withdrew a thick ledger I had not noticed before. I requested these foundation records from Inspector Japp last week. Vance was obsessed with maintaining his image of incorruptible respectability. He did not steal those bonds to flee to Argentina. He stole them to balance the Foundation's books before the annual audit. Sir Felix leaned forward, his hands trembling. Then where is the money, Poirot? Yet we have searched everywhere. You searched for £20,000 deposited as a single sum, Poirot explained, opening the ledger with ceremonial care. But Vance was far too methodical for such crude tactics. Observe these entries. Dozens of anonymous donations spanning 6 months. £500 from a grateful widow here, 1,000 from a retired colonel there. He created an entire constellation of fictitious benefactors, slowly bleeding the stolen bonds back into the Foundation's accounts through carefully orchestrated anonymous gifts. The room fell silent as Sir Felix studied the meticulous handwritten entries, his expression transforming from despair to amazement. You mean the money is already in the Foundation's accounts? He whispered. Precisely. The charity was never in danger, Sir Felix. The widows and orphans will have their security. Vance balanced the books with the blood of 3 innocent people, but the funds themselves rest safely in your institution's vaults. The auditors saw only the generosity of strangers, never suspecting the dark origins of their salvation. Sir Felix buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the bitter irony. When he finally departed, clutching the ledger that represented both damnation and deliverance, I turned to Poirot with mixed feelings. A strange sort of justice, I observed. The only justice human nature permits, mon ami, Poirot replied, straightening his waistcoat with characteristic precision. Vance destroyed himself to preserve the very institution he had betrayed. In death, his crimes have been transformed into unwitting philanthropy. He moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling London street where life continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas played out in fog-shrouded chambers and country houses. You suspected him from the very beginning, didn't you? I asked. Poirot's smile was gentle but knowing. A man who arrives unannounced in the night, placing himself ostentatiously in the role of helpless intermediary, always arouses my suspicion. When someone insists too strongly upon their own insignificance, I ask myself, why this performance? But suspicion is not evidence, Hastings. The little grey cells required material proof, which came only through patient observation of human behavior. And his greatest error was inviting you into the case at all. Exactly. He imagined Hercule Poirot would admire his impossible locked room trick, pronounce it unsolvable, and lend authority to the legend of its impossibility. He failed to comprehend that I concern myself not with tricks, but with the psychology of tricksters. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Persian carpet, Poirot returned to his correspondence, each envelope aligned with geometric perfection. The affair of the 11th Witness was finally, completely resolved. 3 murders solved, justice served, and even the stolen money restored to its intended purpose. "Come, Hastings," he announced suddenly, reaching for his hat. "The spring air beckons, and I am told the daffodils in Hyde Park display an admirable symmetry. After contemplating the disordered hearts of men, it will comfort me to observe something planned with proper taste and precision." The little grey cells had triumphed once again, saying not through the examination of physical evidence, but through the relentless analysis of human psychology, proving that the most dangerous criminal is often the one who appears most eager to help solve the very crimes he has committed. The gentle warmth of late April had finally banished winter's grip from London, and with it, the last shadows of the 11th Witness affair seemed to lift from the city's collective memory. In the ordered sanctuary of Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat by his morning window, methodically sorting his correspondence with silver letter opener in hand. Each envelope received the same precise treatment, a single, perfectly straight incision that spoke to his fundamental need for geometric perfection in all things. "It provides considerable satisfaction, Hastings," Poirot observed, placing a cleanly opened letter onto his meticulously arranged stack. "When the chaotic elements of human passion are finally catalogued and filed away, the mind can then return to its proper state of equilibrium." The doorbell's measured chime interrupted our peaceful morning, and George appeared with his customary discretion, bearing a silver tray with a single calling card. "Mr. Geoffrey Trent requests a moment of your time, sir," George announced quietly. "Ah, show him in," Poirot replied, his green eyes brightening with interest. "The young solicitor requires a final benediction before he can truly close this chapter of his troubled conscience." The visitor's transformation. Geoffrey Trent entered our sitting room, transformed beyond recognition. The pallor of terror that had haunted his features during our previous encounters had vanished entirely, replaced by a genuine vitality that spoke of a man finally freed from the weight of terrible knowledge. He carried a small rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he held with both hands like a sacred offering. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," Trent began, offering respectful nods to each of us. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I felt compelled to express my deepest gratitude. If you had not forced the truth into the light, I fear I would have spent my entire career jumping at shadows, forever haunted by what I overheard on that terrace at High Gables." Poirot gestured toward a comfortable armchair with characteristic precision. "Sit, mon ami. You carried a heavy burden for one so young. Silence, and when it conceals murder, becomes a poison that slowly corrodes the soul. You have taken the antidote. You have spoken truth. Now you must look toward the future." Trent's smile carried both relief and lingering melancholy. "I have resigned from my current firm, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Felix Braithwaite has graciously offered me a junior partnership in his chambers. He says we both have much to learn about the true nature of justice, beyond the mere mechanical application of legal precedent." "An excellent arrangement," Poirot nodded approvingly. "Sir Felix is now a man who understands humility, a rare and invaluable quality in any judge." the symbolic gift. Trent placed his wrapped parcel upon the low table between them with ceremonial care. "I brought you a small token of appreciation, Monsieur Poirot, and I observed during our meetings that you possess a particular appreciation for precision and order." With meticulous attention, Poirot untied the string and folded back the paper to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden box. Inside, resting on dark velvet, lay a complete set of antique brass weights, each piece scaled with absolute mathematical precision and gleaming with the patina of age and careful maintenance. "Magnifique," Poirot whispered, his eyes gleaming with genuine delight. "Perfect balance, perfect symmetry. It is a gift that speaks directly to the heart of Hercule Poirot." "They belong to my grandfather," Trent explained softly. "He used them in his work as an assayer of precious metals. I thought they might represent the scales of justice you so brilliantly balanced in our case." Poirot closed the box gently, and his hands treating it like a sacred relic. "I shall treasure them always, mon ami. But carry this lesson with you into your new career. The law provides the scales, yes, but it is the human heart that provides the weights. Greed, fear, pride, and vanity are the heavy stones that unbalance the soul. Julian Vance allowed his pride to outweigh his humanity entirely. He believed himself the master of the scales, but he was merely another flawed weight upon them." Poirot's reflections. After Trent departed with visibly lighter steps, Poirot carefully placed the wooden box upon his mantelpiece, adjusting it with minute precision until it sat exactly centered, perfectly aligned with his antique clock. The afternoon light caught the polished wood, casting geometric shadows that seemed to please his aesthetic sensibilities immensely. "A most satisfactory conclusion, Hastings," he murmured, stepping back to admire his arrangement. "Indeed," I agreed. "You have restored balance to a world temporarily thrown into chaos." Poirot moved to his favorite armchair, settling with characteristic precision before speaking again. His voice carried that particular tone of philosophical reflection I had learned to associate with cases that had touched him more deeply than usual. "This affair differed from many others, mon ami, not in its mechanics, but in its psychology. Julian Vance attacked the very foundations of trust upon which civilized society rests. Most murderers strike from desperation or passion, crude emotions that leave crude evidence. But Vance wielded respectability itself as his weapon, using the trust placed in him as both shield and sword." He paused to adjust a silver ornament by perhaps a millimeter, his need for external order reflecting his internal processing of the case's moral complexities. He loved his reputation more than truth, more than justice, more than the lives that depended upon his decisions. In his twisted logic, preserving that image justified any sacrifice except the one sacrifice that might have saved him: his own vanity. The deeper truth. "Yet there remains a bitter irony in his fate," Poirot continued, his green eyes reflecting the afternoon light. "The stolen money he killed to conceal has become the salvation of the very institution he betrayed. The widows and orphans will survive another winter, warmed by funds that carry the blood of 3 innocent souls." Justice and irony. The Hastings, they often wear remarkably similar faces. I leaned forward, struck by the weight in his voice. "Do you regret exposing him, Poirot, given that the foundation was ultimately preserved?" "No," he replied without hesitation, then paused thoughtfully. "But I confess to a certain fatigue when I contemplate how small a thing may topple a life built over decades of apparent virtue. For Vance, it began with mere financial embarrassment, a loss he believed he could repair before discovery. Yet each concealment bred another, until the thought of honest confession became more terrifying than murder itself. The final understanding." Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling London street where life continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas played out in fog-shrouded chambers and country houses. The 11th Witness Club believed itself immune to such temptations because its members examined crimes as intellectual puzzles, removed from the messiness of blood and grief. Yet it was precisely there, among those trained legal minds, that vanity and fear combined to produce the most elegant monstrosity I have ever encountered. "Will such societies form again?" I asked, remembering the haunted faces of those distinguished men as Vance was led away through the fog. "Certainement," Poirot replied with a faint smile. "Somewhere there will always be another club, another committee, another gathering where men of good appearance and wounded pride discuss right and wrong as though they were academic subjects. And when, inevitably, one of them decides that moral rules apply to everyone except himself, the little grey cells must go to work again." He straightened a picture frame by the smallest degree as he passed, then turned back to me with that mixture of vanity and profound understanding that was uniquely his own. "But today, Hastings, order has been restored. The guilty have faced justice, the innocent have found peace, and even the stolen funds have found their way to worthy hands. It is enough. It must be enough." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across our sitting room, Hercule Poirot returned to his correspondence, each piece of paper aligned with geometric perfection. The affair of the 11th Witness was finally, completely closed, not merely solved, but understood in all its complex moral dimensions. The little grey cells had triumphed once again, proving that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most eager to help solve the very crimes they have committed. Yet in that triumph lay the eternal burden of the detective, to see clearly into the human heart, where respectability and evil can coexist with terrifying ease, separated only by the thin line of moral choice that each person must navigate alone. Outside, London continued its ancient dance of commerce and ambition, while inside our quiet sanctuary, order reigned supreme. A small but perfect victory against the chaos that forever threatens to overwhelm the fragile architecture of civilized society.